Welcome to the joint Acronis and Acronis SCS weekly speaker program. This is, I think, at least the 10th in that series. Today we have the pleasure to introduce, I have the pleasure to introduce my old friend Marie Roch, who is a professor of computer science at San Diego State University. Marie is an interdisciplinary scientist who works on animal bioacoustics, studied the questions of identification, behavior, communications through computational analysis, like machine learning of signal produced in a wild population. Marie is a professor of computer science, had a PhD at University of Iowa, and the podium is yours, Marie.
All right, well, thank you so much, Joe, for inviting me. It's good to be here and talk to you all. I wish it was in person, but even if there wasn't the pandemic, this still wouldn't be in person for all of us, right? Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the fact that this isn't done in a vacuum. And the two projects that I'm going to be talking about today are part of a project that I'm running with the Office of Naval Research, where we've brought together a number of the players in bioacoustics to take a look at how we can exploit contextual cues. And so the people involved on this, just to go through very quickly, we have people from NOAA Fisheries, that's Danny Chelowak, Erica Fleischman, Danny's a biologist. Erica Fleischman's also a biologist up at Oregon State. Douglas Gillespie is somebody a bit more like me with an engineering type hat at St. Andrews University, which is one of the leading bioacoustic centers. Tyler Helbley is at NIWC West. He works out on the Navy ranges. Everybody's envious of him because he gets access to these huge Navy arrays, and it's really cool stuff. Holger Klink is my longtime collaborator and friend from Cornell. Xiaobai Liu is a professor at San Diego State. And then we also have Shyam Madhusudana, who's a postdoc at Cornell and a former student from my lab, as well as people from the University of Hawaii, Eva Marie Nozal, and Yushu, who's a research scientist at Cornell, as well as my friend and colleague, Anna Shurevich, who just moved to, I think, Finland, if I remember correctly. She just took a position out there. But at the time, she was at A&M. All right, well, in terms of what we do, before I actually get into the project, I want to talk a tiny bit about how these things work, because most people who I talk to who have anything to do with machine learning really don't know anything about the type of stuff we do. So we basically engage in something called passive acoustic monitoring. And what that means is that we are going to take instruments and throw them in the water. A lot of times we're deploying these to very deep depths. It's not atypical for us to deploy to 1,300 meters, which means you need pressure hardened cases so they don't implode on each other. You need ways of recovering the instruments, and we drop them down in the water from anywhere from 6 months to a year, go back and retrieve them, and then start to analyze the recordings that come back. These are very broadband recordings. If we take a look at what we're doing, what we're recording, it really would depend on what type of species we were interested in. If you were to take a look at something like this blue whale here, their vocalizations are infrasonic. Essentially, we can't always hear them. Some of them are very low pitched. When you take a look at fish, they're fairly low pitched. You could get away with low sample rates. As we start taking a look at the delphinids or toothed whales, we see that you need to record at a much higher recording rate. Typically, if these are the guys we're recording, we'll be recording at 200 kilohertz. If we're interested in trying to pick up a porpoise, like a Dall's porpoise that is shown here, then you got to go up to about 350 or even higher kilohertz. Now, what this basically shows you is with the year's worth of recording, how much data are you picking up? And this dotted line running across, this shows us how many terabytes were estimated to be in the Library of Congress in 2000. So in 1 year, with one instrument at the rates that we usually record, which are typically 200 or 325 kilohertz, we are going to record more data than there is in the Library of Congress. We use more than one instrument. This is showing the, I think this was a snapshot from last year, taking a look at all of the deployments that we had from my collaborators at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So we have a couple petabytes of data. So these are very large data projects that we're looking at, and we have to figure out ways of mining this and pulling information out of them. Okay, by the way, if you guys have questions, please jump in. Okay, don't feel you have to wait to the end. So of course, you know, we do this for a reason. The most compelling reasons in terms of looking at why somebody would give us money to do this has to do with regulatory monitoring. So if you are somebody who's going out and doing something in the ocean, like oil exploration, or maybe you're in the Navy and you want to run an exercise, you need to be doing monitoring, and that's required by US law. So we need to develop techniques to help people do the monitoring. There's also questions of mitigation. If we are doing things that might be having an impact on animals, one, we have to figure out what those are. And we need to see if there's things that we could possibly do to change it so the impact is less harmful. And finally, when we start thinking about, you know, other reasons that you might want to do it, one is just pure research to know and understand how our world works. But also, if you're a policymaker and you're interested in trying to come up with responsible ways of exploiting the ocean, understanding what behaviors are going on, what the seasonality of behaviors are, all of these things can really help you make decisions that, you know, might have negligible impact on somebody's, you know, bottom line, but have a very positive impact on animals. So these are the things we need to know. Now, the price of doing this is very low compared to sending a ship out and trying to do monitoring. That's, you know, the Scripps instruments that was showing you, that's kind of the Cadillac of instruments and one of the more expensive ones. We can stick one of those in the water for maybe about $50,000, $60,000 for the instrument, plus the ship cost to get it out there. And compared to putting a ship out there for that year's period, that's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. The other thing that happens is that passive acoustic monitoring is really good for the ocean because the ocean is dark. And when you take a look at how far light propagates, it just doesn't go very far. So for marine organisms, it's very common to use sound. And when you take a look at whales and dolphins, they rely on it, you know, almost all the time. I mean, if they were to go deaf, that would be kind of the end of the world for them. Okay. And the final thing I want to point out about, you know, why we do this type of stuff is that if you want to really understand if we are having impact on animals, you have to look at large time scales. Many of the processes that affect the animals in the ocean operate at decadal time scales. And if you look at just a season or two, you know, you go out for a couple of years and collect information, you're not going to know whether or not that change is because there was some oceanographic change that happened, or whether it was part of a longer cycle and it was something normal, or are we impacting them? So all of these things are really important. All right, so before I jump into any of the machine learning stuff, I do want to give you one example of the type of downstream things that we do with this. Once we've done all the machine learning and, you know, mined out detections and localizations and things of that nature. And this is a paper that I did a little while ago with Anna, who's one of the co-authors I was talking about. And we're taking a look at blue whales. And this was looking in the Southern California Bight, which is essentially the region here off Southern California. So Hollywood's up here, San Diego's down here. And all of these little squares are where we have recording devices. And what we did was we took a look at the ocean bottom and we took a look at the contours and stuff, and we did some propagation modeling to get an idea of how far away would we be likely to hear and detect a blue whale beak call. Now I'm going to play an example of a beak call just so that you know what those sound like. This has been sped up quite a bit. If we were to play it at the normal rate, one, it would be much longer, but more importantly, unless you had a really good subwoofer on your computer, you probably wouldn't hear it. So hopefully you'll hear this if Zoom is working right. Did you all hear the tone? Yeah, so basically the blue whales they use us to communicate. They use sounds to basically advertise when they found food so they can share it. There's a lot of reasons why they have to be able to communicate. And by listening to the sounds they're making, we can get an idea of when they are in particular areas. So we analyze all this and we normalize for the detection radius. So for example, if you take a look at site H, if we're going out in these particular directions, we expect to hear blue whales quite some distance away. If we're going out over here, if you look at the bathymetry, you can see that essentially you're going down, the bottom's dropping and then it's coming back up. Well, that's essentially creating acoustic shadow. So we don't expect to hear much beyond in that particular direction. So we've normalized all of these sites by the area that we expect we can detect things. And in this next slide, we are essentially taking all of those sites and aligning them roughly north to south and looking over about a 7-year period to see, when are the animals there? And you can see that there are clear patterns, from year to year when animals are there. And we can also see that there is more blue whales up north than down south. And that's very consistent with what we would expect to see based on visual sightings. But this is a much more persistent thing and looking every day as opposed to a visual person who might go out and do a survey once or twice a season. We can also take a look at these things over time, taking a look at both spatially and temporally where things are happening. So this is showing for each of these sites the relative amount of calling that we're seeing. And as you can see right now, we're in kind of peak blue whale season. So if you're into whale watching, now's a good time to go out and try to find a blue whale. All right, so that's kind of enough of the background. And we're going to move into talking about a couple projects to give you an idea of the type of stuff that we do. So the 2 projects that I've decided to focus on are 2 things that were just recently came out. One has to do with a toothed whale, a dolphin, and the other is related to one of the larger guys, a blue whale, sorry, a fin whale. So this is work with Puli, who's a PhD student of one of my collaborators, Xiaobai Liu. And what we're trying to do is basically take a look at the whistles that dolphins are producing. So in this spectrogram, this is about 5 seconds going across. And you can see that the animals are whistling. So, the frequency is increasing. So that type of thing. I don't do dolphin whistles very well, but that's essentially the type of thing that you're going to be hearing if we were to play this. And the goal is to design an algorithm that goes through and basically annotates these automatically. So what you see down here is an example of an annotation that was done by machine. And we worked on this about 10 years ago, and we came up with a system that worked reasonably well, but we decided to revisit it to see if we could basically exploit some context to do a little bit better at this. So to take a look at the way people traditionally do this, what people are doing are taking a look for peaks, and then they are assembling them into whistles, much like what you see right here. And this is based on the graph search, a graph search algorithm that we redesigned, as I said, about 10 years ago. But all of the things, even right up to 2021, almost all of these rely on just taking a look at the energy and trying to figure out if there's whistle energy there. Now, this can be complicated by these vertical lines through here, which are dolphins making echolocation clicks. So they're sitting there and they're echolocating to try to find prey, to see, not run into the ocean bottom, that type of thing, to navigate. And these things all make it harder to find the peaks. So we decided to focus on peak finding, and we wanted to know whether or not we could design a network that would allow us to detect peaks in a more robust and reliable way. We were also interested in whether or not we could learn to do this with smaller amounts of data, because getting annotated data for supervised learning is expensive. Okay, so this was the things that we had to kind of look out for is if you take a look at where there's peak energy, there are very few of those compared to the places where there's noise or there's echolocation clicks. There was a severe class imbalance in this problem. So We looked at some data that we had used back in 2011, where we had paid somebody to annotate a whole bunch of stuff. And we picked a rather difficult subset of this, where we know that our algorithm was not performing as well. So in this subset, we basically had about 7,000 whistles that we used for training, and we had about a little under 1,000 that we used to test on this. So we measured our performance with precision and recall. We basically had a couple of different precision recalls we were measuring. One was taking a look at the peak detection system, because that's really what we were working on this time. And for this, we used the Berkeley segmentation data set tools and their protocol. For the taking the peaks and assembling them into whistles, we used a graph search algorithm that we had used prior to that. And our criteria for detecting a correct whistle was that the whistle had to be at least 150 milliseconds long. So anything really, really short, we didn't expect to find. And we expected at least a third of the whistle was reasonably strong, greater than or equal to 10 dB. The other thing we did is we did some quality metrics. We basically made sure that the whistles had appropriate amounts of overlap in time. And, because sometimes the system won't get the entire whistle. And we also made sure that the annotator and the detection system were reasonably congruent in where they actually picked the whistle energy. It wasn't just enough to overlap in time, because we were really interested in picking up that contour. So those were the things we were looking for. All right, so the way that we did this was we basically decided to take our spectrogram, and we basically broke it up into small patches. Okay, and this was one of the ways that we addressed the class imbalance, not entirely, but by operating on small sections where we had little bits of it. And the other thing that was nice about this is that whistle shapes are fairly complicated. And when you break it into a patch, the energy that you have related to the whistle is usually a slightly simpler shape. And in some ways, it's a little bit like a dictionary learner. And that's the way Xiaobai likes to think about it. I'm not entirely convinced that's the right way to do it. But in any case, we're operating on these patches, and we built a ResNet network. So, nothing particularly fancy. And we were learning to predict where whistle energy was. And once we've done this on the patches, then we reassembled it into a confidence map, and then used our existing whistle extraction algorithms on it. And one of the things that I found kind of interesting was that the ResNet was really able to learn that the echolocation clicks were not relevant to the detection task, and did a pretty good job of pulling out the relevant whistle energy. And that's because the convolution was picking up on contextual cues, not just looking for one peak in one time slice of the spectrogram. All right, so when we took a look at how this worked, when we were looking at the peaks, we basically had a precision recall curve like this. This is the optimal point, which had an F1 score of 0.795. We were operating at 0.5, so we were up here, not quite as good, 0.781. And we took anything that was defined as a peak having greater than 0.5, and we threw it into our graph search algorithm. When we did this, we saw that our precision and recall went up quite a bit. When we take a look at our precision on this difficult set, and then, the wider set, we did much better, but with the older algorithm, we had a 63% precision and about a 63% recall. This went up to 95 and 82% respectively, which makes a very large difference. Yeah. Now, as I said, we were interested in trying to do this with less data. So we wanted to know whether or not we could do this in other ways. One thing we decided to try was to take the labels from the whistles, so data that we have gathered, and synthetically inject those into noise, with the idea that if we moved into a totally different area where the noise regime was completely different, we might be able to synthesize whistles in order to be able to learn to recognize things in this novel noise regime. The second thing that we did was we wanted to know whether or not we could go totally away from whistles to see if we could do all right on that. And in order to do that, we leveraged some of the work that has been done in image annotation. So we basically went off to the Berkeley segmentation data set, which has a whole bunch of images that have been annotated by hand. So here we have an example of elephants with the contour lines on top of them. And we use these contours as if they were whistles, injecting them into ocean background noise, and learned based on these. Now, we don't expect this to work quite as well because there are some things here that would never ever look like a whistle. I mean, we don't have whistles that go almost straight up and down like you see in this trunk or the elephant's leg. Okay. And in more recent versions, work that isn't published, who's been putting in some filters to basically, reject out some of those types of things. So in terms of our synthesis, we start off with some ocean noise. We inject either whistles into it or we inject natural contours into it. So the way that we are doing this injection is we start off with the background noise, and we basically take our labels, whether they come from elephants or homes or whatever the picture is, or from annotations of whistles, and we convolve it with a Gaussian filter. And the idea is to introduce a little bit of blur there, which hopefully simulates a little bit of the spectral leakage that you would have in a real audio recording. Okay. So the Gaussian blur basically is coming from this distribution, and we've got a little bit of wiggle room, if you want, in the standard deviation. And the other thing that we're doing is we're modifying the amplitudes that we're putting these in as well. And we're just doing that from a random uniform distribution. Okay. Now, when we do the training, the other thing that we wanted to do was see whether or not we could try to get the algorithm to focus on the hard parts. Okay, so if you take it, this is essentially like some of the ideas behind boosting, right? Find the hard examples and see if you can do better with them. So we call this recall guided synthesis. And the idea is that we basically take the current network and we take a look at all of the patches that we're classifying, and we compute the recall on them. And when we're taking a look at which patches to sample as we train the network, we are essentially, if it's a negative patch, if there's no whistles in it, we just pick negative patches randomly. But if it's a positive patch, what we're going to do is we're going to make it so if we had a hard time classifying it, we've got a better chance of picking it, and this will bias towards the harder examples. Okay. Now, in terms of experiments that we conducted on this, our baseline was essentially the work that we did a number of years ago. We could have used one of the other algorithms that's around, but we had source code for this one. It was easy, so that's what we picked. Our deep ResNet, which is using all of our training data, that's going to be kind of our target. It's not really the baseline because it's a new technique, but it is the baseline in terms of seeing whether or not our synthesis-based techniques can, do as well. They don't, but they do pretty well. And our synthesis experiments, we're taking a look at a number of conditions. First one we called micro whistle ground truth. And what we did is we were using the ground truth from the human annotators, but we picked only about 6% of it to do the training. So significantly reduced data set. Okay. Then we went ahead and we used the edges from the Berkeley segmentation data set. That was our second experiment. And the third experiment, we wanted to know if we could cut humans entirely out of the loop. So what we did was we ran a modified canny edge detector across the Berkeley images and used the output of the canny edge detector as our training data to do the synthesis. And the final experiment was to take that 6% data set and introduce the recall guidance into it. So this is kind of how we did. So let's take a look first at the peak finding. So this is the peak finding curve that I showed you a little bit before with where we have all of our training data. As you can see, unfortunately, it dominates every other technique, right? But all of these techniques do offer something, and we can actually do better than our baseline code with any of these. Okay, so when we take a look at it, we see that if we take a look at the using real labels, not real data, but real labels, actually works reasonably well. If we add the recall guiding to it, it gives us a little bit of a boost. It's not a tremendous boost, but it does make a difference. And these two curves over here are essentially the edge detection ones. The one way on the back, that's the one where we've thrown humans out of the loop. And this is the one with the human analysts. So we're not quite there where we have something entirely synthetic. We're doing some new experiments with GANs where we're taking a look at other ways to generate stuff. And we still haven't hit the point that we can come anywhere near this curve, but that's kind of what we're working towards. All right, in terms of the results, once you actually throw them into the second stage algorithm, which does the whistle assembling, and that's also something that we're working on, is replacing that with a neural network with some new funding that's just starting. So we take a look at, we've already seen the first and last row, and our improvement in the F1 score was 39% from the original stuff we looked at. When we take a look at the any of the edge detection stuff, you know, our precision is pretty good, right? 91 and 90% compared to what we had when we started. It's not as good as when we have all the data that we need. When we take a look at the recall, we've lost a little bit when we're doing the canny edge detector. When we look at the very small data set, again, the place that we're losing is the recall. And so we think we're just not seeing enough of the examples of things in order to really be learning that distribution. You know, precision is reasonable all the way throughout. So that's kind of where we are on that work in terms of the stuff that we have out. As I said, we are doing some more. Just to give you an example of what this looks like, up here we essentially have an analyst who's annotated a bunch of stuff. This is kind of a gnarly one to be annotating because this is in the proximity of a big research ship that has an echo sounder going on. So this is this type thing that's here in the background. Of course, that doesn't mess up the human analyst. If we take a look at our original algorithm, these noise regime changes here just play havoc with us. But when we take a look at the ResNet, it doesn't get too confused with this type of stuff. All right, the second project that I'd like to transition to, we're going from small to big, and we're taking a look at fin whales, second largest animal on the planet. And we are interested in taking a look at their singing. So the idea here is to recognize this 20 hertz song where we have notes here. I forget the time axis on this. This is probably a few minutes, okay? So essentially, the baseline model here was a standard CNN, right? So we're essentially stepping the CNN across the spectrogram, and we are hitting some of the notes reasonably well, but not all of them. There are certainly ones that we're missing. And what we were interested in doing was trying to figure out whether we could exploit the context by adding a larger contextual window and seeing what we might get with that. And that was the basic idea. When you take a look at most of the work that's been done, trying to take a look at any of these kind of hybrid convolutional neural networks, followed by some type of recurrent network, which is the direction we're going, most of them essentially have something where it's kind of integrated and everything's on the same time scale. Now, if you have something like speech where your prior information is fairly close to you temporally, that actually works reasonably well. When we start taking a look at things like these song notes, you need to have the fine resolution for the CNN to actually pick up the call. But because the calls are interspaced by so much, we start to have problems with the recurrent network losing a lot of the information. So we decided to basically build a two-stage network where the first stage was the CNN, and the second stage was something that was operating at the level of individual CNN predictions. Okay, so there are many fewer steps between each of the calls, and that allowed us to preserve the information. So we basically came up with a couple of different ways of doing this. One was to use our baseline convolutional network and to just take a look at the score and put the score into an LSTM. One of the things that this LSTM does not have is it doesn't have a forward and backward thing. And I really think we should have done that, but that's water under the bridge. The second thing that we did was we basically took a look at a feature embedding and fed the embedding into the LSTM instead of the score. And the final one was to kind of take the hybrid of these two and look at both the score and the embedding. Now, what we were analyzing for this was from a single site, just essentially kind of west of LA, kind of around Ventura. And we had about 7 years worth of data, not continuous, but a fair amount of data. And we tried to analyze to pick up these fin whale songs. So these, as I said earlier, they're about 20 hertz, okay? There's, you're talking about 30, 40 seconds between calls. It does variable, the interpulse or internote interval really does vary depending upon the animal, the behavioral state. But there is some regularity of these, and when you start looking at the distributions, you can see that they're multimodal, but there certainly are modes to this. Once they start singing, they might sing for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, they might sing for hours. It just really depends on what they feel like doing. So in order to evaluate this, we basically did tenfold cross-validation. Because these are fairly stereotyped calls, we capped the number of training examples, both positive and negative, at 20,000. And we basically did some loss weighting on this as well. Trained the convolutional networks. And once we had the convolutional networks, that's when we started training the LSTMs, either by just taking the output scores or essentially lopping off the head and taking the representation network and representation out of that and training on that. So nothing special about the training. We typically did 60 epochs with an atom optimizer. There was dropout and no data augmentation. Okay. This is an example of how the network did. We have up here the actual fin whale song. We can see the annotations where the human went through and basically said, okay, here's the song notes. And the CNN is doing reasonably well. There are places where it misses things like right here and here. And there are places where it's a fairly low confidence, but things that really weren't happening. When we start taking a look at the LSTMs, we see that particularly the latter two, the ones that take into account the representation, those are able to pick up the missed notes reasonably well. And part of that is because they have the context of these other notes around them. Okay, those are being fed in as well with that longer step. We see a little bit of that with the score, but not quite as strongly. You can also see that where the CNN was picking up the kind of false positive signal, all of our LSTMs have been able to kind of say, well, maybe that's not so real. Unless you have a very low threshold, that's probably not going to trigger false positive. But we think that this is good evidence that it's picking up on this repetitive nature of the song. Okay. In terms of the performance, if we take a look at the CNN network, this is our PR curve. Here we're taking a look at F1 versus threshold. We've normalized all of the scores so that we could compare across folds. And when we start throwing in some of the other things, just putting in the score, so the second stage that doesn't look at the representation at all, does a really nice job of dominating the earlier precision recall curve. If we add in either of the LSTMs that are taking a look at the precision, at the representation layers, then we can see that we get quite another little gain out of it. The other types of things that we have done are we've looked at some things where right now, everything we've talked about is taking a look at the prediction point. Okay. And as here's our context and here's where we predict it. And as we go across, we're always trying to predict that last one. We've done some experiments that I don't think are nearly as interesting as the initial one, but we've taken a look to see as we vary the prediction point, what do we see in terms of performance? Okay, and this is a place that I think really, if we put in that reverse LSTM that would have been interesting. The other thing that we looked at is as we advance through the song, if we're advancing by 1¼ second as opposed to 1 second, does that make a difference? So these aren't really the main story, but it did result in a lot of additional experiments. We had the advance, and the 2 second, what was it? Sorry, 1 second versus 1¼ second. So we essentially had 20 CNNs that we trained, and then we had all the variants of the models, and we had a lot of different models that we were training for this. When we take a look at the results for these types of things, what we basically see is that as we vary the prediction point, these curves all look not quite the same, but somewhat similar. So the system's able to predict even if you vary the prediction point a bit, which I don't find particularly surprising. We do see a little bit of trends in some of these things as we go through. To walk us through, this is showing us the area under the curve. Here's the CNN model. And here we're taking a look at the 3 different models, hybrid models, where we're looking at varying the prediction point either at the end, which was that first set of experiments we predicted, or taking a look down a little bit. If we want to advance 1¼ we can do that too. And we see a little bit of difference in here, but nothing to really write home about. So the key things I think in this study are really that we can use feature embeddings to propagate information over a longer period of time and pick up on patterns and stuff. So if you guys have any questions, be more than happy to take them. And I'd like to thank ONR for funding this project.
Joe, I guess you're mute.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thanks again. There was excellent topic, very intriguing. We have a few questions that people have texted, and I'm just going to take them one at a time. Looks like there are about 6 or 7 of them. The first one I asked early on is, how did you encode the sound?
How do we encode the sound?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of encoding the sound, I guess the question is really, what do you mean by that? Do we mean in terms of the representation that's passed to the network? Or
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the network is essentially seeing a spectrogram. And when we take a look at the first project, it's a spectrogram that gets normalized. So essentially everything gets mapped between a maximum and minimum value. And there's some scaling going on there. When we take a look at the second project, the input to the spectrogram, and I kind of glossed over this because I didn't think I'd have enough time, basically has two layers right after the input layer that are essentially taking Laplacians or Gaussians. So the idea is to kind of increase some of the contrast between the signal and the noise in there. And so Shyam set this up with 2 different widths, and I'd have to go back and take a look at his notes to see exactly what he used for those. I don't remember the detail, but the idea is one spreads a little bit more than the other. And if you wanted to think about an analogy of this, it's a bit like the multi-resolution techniques that you see in computer vision.
Very good. The next question was from Katerina, and it asks, do you think that this approach can be applied to network monitoring?
I'm sorry, to what?
Do you think that this approach can be applied to network monitoring?
Network monitoring. It's a good question. I haven't done much with network monitoring. I don't think that if you're looking for anomaly detection, I'm not sure that this is the approach that you'd want to take. I also don't know the anomaly literature all that well, so I don't know that that's really a fair thing to say. If you have something that is very reasonably regular, then yeah, maybe you could do something with it. The thing that I don't know is I haven't looked I had enough network traffic other than when I'm trying to debug why my firewall isn't working, to really know what to expect. So I'm sorry, Katerina, I can't give you a real solid answer on that.
Okay, next one from Dan Smith. Which cetaceans have the most complicated or number of whistles, which have the
Okay.
most basic set of sounds?
Okay, so Dan, in general, the baleen whales, which are the big ones, and they don't have teeth, they essentially have hair. Most of their sounds are simpler. That's not true for all of them, but if you look across most of the species, that's true. A good exception to that is the humpback whale. Okay, the humpback whale has very complicated song. Now, when you take a look at the toothed whales, there are some that are fairly easy. Like, for example, the melon-headed whales don't have a lot of variety in their whistles. I would say that probably the belugas have the most complicated whistles. They're known as the canaries of the sea. And then you also have things like, for example, the common dolphins, which is what you're seeing in this picture that's up right now. Common dolphins, they sometimes aggregate in these really large groups. And you can have these, multiple pods assembling to form this megapod with thousands of animals. And I've seen it out there, and it's really kind of amazing. And if you have a hydrophone that's listening in on them, it's just this cacophony, and it looks like spaghetti. But those are tough.
I have a follow-up on that. Do you notice, to the extent possible to notice, different languages or idioms or modes of making sounds between different pods of dolphins?
You can. It's not been shown in every species, but killer whales are a good example of this. If you are a killer whale expert, I'm not. I know more about them than somebody off the street, but certainly, somebody who spends their life studying killer whales, they can listen to calls and they can tell you which pod they belong to. They essentially have these clan dialects, and just by looking and listening, you can identify the clan, which is really pretty neat.
I guess that's it's a partial answer to the next question. So before you answering it, I'll ask the question: do mammals, I suppose sea mammals, make natural language like communications, like sequences of sounds over span of time?
So that's a loaded question. Okay, so they do make sequences of sound, and they can communicate ideas. Okay, so that much is clear. That's been proven. Okay, it's been proven in a number of species. It's not just like we've only seen it in one animal. Okay, there's examples of this. Or if you take a look at anything from chimpanzees to meerkats, they have shown that animals can convey danger. They can specify the type of danger. So like meerkats have different signals if the predator is a hawk versus if the predator is a snake. Okay, and they do produce these in sequences. Okay, so there is some type of thing like with the meerkats, if they modify the order of things, there may be some difference in the meaning. Okay, that's something that my colleague Martha Manser in Switzerland, who I have a project on meerkats with, has basically, she's convinced me. She hasn't convinced everybody, okay, for this. But if we take a look at these animals in particular, they have some really complicated social behaviors. And I don't see how they can do them without some type of communication. So while it hasn't been shown in dolphins, I mean, there have been things that have been shown, like, for example, for many of the delphinids, we know that they have names. They have a whistle that essentially is an identifier of this is me. And other animals will sometimes replicate that whistle when they are trying to attract the other one. So there's clearly something going on here. And I mean, you know, when you take a look at some of these animals, and that especially the baleen whales, their brain is like 7 times larger than ours. It's, you know, there's probably something going on in there.
We have another question from Katerina. Were you able to draw any conclusions from the model output? And then the follow-up is, any specific patterns in the behavior of whales commonly associated with those sounds?
Okay, so in terms of taking a look at the outputs, really the detection part is kind of the first stage of it, right? And in these 2 projects, these are essentially where we are. These are fairly recent things. The fin whale project just came out, and the in terms of the whistle project, that came out last summer. But I have an undergrad working on it now, trying to package it up in a format that biologists can actually use. And he's wonderful. I really like working with him, but he doesn't write things in a way that somebody who's not a computer scientist is ever going to be able to use. Okay, so if we want these projects to actually have impact, we have to put them in an easy to use format, so somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing can go off and exploit them. And when we take a look at the types of things that we can do with them, and I haven't with these 2 projects, but other ones, we've built echolocation click detectors. And one of the things we've done with that is we've applied it over a long time series, and we found that at least in one region, when the moon is bright, there's not a lot of echolocation. And but other times in day, you don't see a lot of echolocation, but at night, suddenly the animals are just, you know, click, click, click. And we think what they're doing is they're hunting, okay? And these animals that we're looking at, we looked at, the paper we published was on common dolphins, but we've also seen this behavior in rhesus dolphins, which is just another type of dolphin. They feed on a lot of squid. And squid are animals that live very, very deep. And most of during the day, they're too deep for the dolphins to access as prey. But at night, they come up to feed. So they live down by the oxygen minimum zone where there's not a lot of food, not a lot of activity. They come up at night because visual predators, it's harder for them to feed on them. But the squid have really big eyes. They've got good low light eyesight, and they can feed on things in the higher layers of the water. And what we think is happening is that these common dolphins are feeding on the squid as they come up. And when there's a really bright moon, we know that the squid and the things that the squid are feeding on don't come up as high. So we suspect that on, you know, very bright nights, the dolphins are saying it's not worth wasting my time trying to hunt because there's not really much to catch. So that's an example of how we can take these detection and classification algorithms that we build and then actually take it to the behavioral state to learn something about the animals.
We have another one from...
Go ahead, Katerina.
That was super exciting. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, there's one more just popped up from Sanjeev. Is there AI study on GPS-based sea mammals behavior or combining sounds with locations?
So there are studies that do that. Okay, so when we're taking a look at marine mammals, that's tricky to do underwater. We do typically, like sometimes we'll put a tag on them right around maybe here, or as close to here as we can get. I'm kind of a fan of the suction cup tags. There are people who use more invasive systems. The problem with the suction cup tags is they don't last very long. If you get an attachment for maybe 10 hours, you would go, oh yeah, that's awesome. You do not get GPS signals underwater, okay? So you're gonna get intermittent fixes, And you may be able to use your accelerometers to do dead reckoning and come up with some idea of what you're doing. What we're working on right now with the Scripps folks is taking it, and this is something that I'm not as involved in yet, but there's a postdoc that I'm working with in Germany who really wants a marine mammal project on the side. She's really bright and she just doesn't have enough to do. So I'm going to be helping her taking a look at localization. So we're basically trying to take a look at signals captured on multiple hydrophones and to localize and track animals. And right now, people have done that. I've been on papers where we've done it, but nobody has a really good system where we can do that in a totally automated way. The Navy folks, my colleague Tyler has a system that's reasonably good, but when we start taking a look at echolocation clicks, it's harder because they don't travel as far and they're very directional. These are essentially like a flashlight beam. If you're right in front of the animal, you get a nice clean signal. As you go off to the side, the intensity drops and also the signal starts falling apart. And that's because they've evolved to do this. It's really cool. They actually have some fatty lipids right in here in the melon that act to focus, a bit like, a magnifying glass when you were a kid and you focused it down to a beam to, burn a piece of paper and your parents yelled at you. So they kind of do that with sound.
And I have the last question. We have just a couple more minutes. Have you ever noticed extraordinary intelligent behavior by any of those sea mammals, or unusual behavior that suggests that was born out of thought?
So I think, and this is not something I have observed, but there's a guy named Bob Pittman. It's actually the guy who took this particular photo. Bob was doing some work down in the Antarctic, and there's a lot of killer whales down there that feed on marine mammals. They target seals, and they essentially have each group of killer whales, each clan, if you want, they have their favorite type of meal. So not just a seal, but a particular species of seal. And different groups have different favorites, just like I like tacos, you like enchiladas, right? So when we take a look at this, they basically split up and they go out and they start spy hopping, essentially coming up above the water to see who's on the ice floe. When they find the type of seal they like, they start whistling like crazy, and it draws the group back together. Okay. Then what these killer whales do is they start charging the ice. They basically create a wave, and the wave washes over the ice and washes let me turn off the screen sharing so you can actually see stuff. So it basically washes the animal off of the ice floe. Now, if the ice floe is too big, they can't do that. Okay, because the seal might get pushed a little, but that's about it. So what they do is they approach deeper, creating a subsurface wave that breaks up the ice. Okay, then they return to strategy one and they wash the poor seal off the ice. Okay, now they've got the animal in the water and they could bite this animal and kill it instantly, but that's not what they do. They grab it by the tail flukes, they drag it down underwater, and they wait for it to drown. It's kind of cruel, but and there's, seals can hold their breath for a long time. So they're doing this for a while. Once they have drowned the seal, they basically pair up. One takes the head, the other takes the tail, and they start pulling and they skin it. Now, if they were terrestrial animals, I would think that they would build a fire next and roast it. Okay, but you can't do that in the water. So this to me really seems like primitive hunter-gatherer intelligence. To evolve schemes that sophisticated, it involves coordination, it involves strategy, it involves deciding, gee, I really don't want to eat the fur, right? That's pretty smart. And the interesting thing is that when you look across the animal kingdom, it's not the only sign of intelligence. There's lots of animals that are much, much smarter than we give them credit for, like all the corvids, all the crows and ravens and stuff. Those guys are scary smart. And I think that if squid live and octopuses lived longer, I think they'd be ruling the planet. They're really smart too.
Yeah, crows definitely make a lot of trouble. They stole my wife's car keys. She put it on the hood.
Oh, no.
The crow came and picked it up and dropped it somewhere. And I had to drive all the way to Palm Springs with the spare keys.
Oh, well, I'm glad you had a spare key.
Anyway, well, that was fascinating. What can I say? This is always a pleasure. I think I heard you before at a seminar at SDSU, but this is always a pleasure. And I'd like to invite you to come back. And certainly, we're always open to hire some of your brightest students. So bring them on.
Will do.
Okay, thanks
All
again.
right. Thank you
Applause.
guys for having me.
All right.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Take care.
Mari.
Very much.
Thank you, Marie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.